Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Do you remember your high school Latin? The root of side comes from two related sources, sidia, meaning killer, and sidium, meaning killing. That's why we see in words like homicide, killing of a person, homo, man, genocide, killing of a people or race, genos, race, insecticide, substances that kill insects. And then there is sociocide, referring to the deliberate destruction of a society, its structures, institutions, cultural practices, and collective identity. Our guest today argues that the U.S. is undergoing a form of sociocide, driven by market competition, technological disruption, environmental crises, and political polarization. Let's discuss. Well, here we are. Warm greetings again, Charlie. We've had you on a couple of times, and I'm looking forward to our conversation again.
Yeah, me too, Pat. In fact, this is the first of three new books I'm doing on American authoritarianism and Trump and so forth. So we might have future chats.
Good. It just is you're well, let's talk about you first. You are a prolific sociologist. You're in Boston College. You've written you write a book a year. Gee, many
Yeah, it's
Christmas.
ridiculous. I
That's
know.
ridiculous. And here are some of your books just for the past 10 years. You're very prolific. We had you on 2024 for Who Owns Democracy with your friend and colleague, Yale Magris. Also, Dying for Capitalism, 2023. Glorious Causes, Moving Beyond Fear, Welcome to the Revolution, Bully Nation, Disinherited Majority, Capitalism, Who Should Buy It, Sociopathic Society, The American Surplus. A book a year. That's pretty darn good. This is your latest book here. It is
Yes,
Bonfire,
correct.
American Sociocide, Broken Relationships, and the Quest for Democracy. And you introduced the term sociocide.
Mhm.
Sociocide, you have suicide, homicide, genocide, and then you are talking about sociocide as kind of a foundation of your book. Give us a definition, or how to tell us about sociocide and how
Okay.
that is
Well, I
cohesive
didn't
to your.
invent the term. It was used by a couple of other sociologists who were talking about societies. They called them sociocidal when they waged genocidal war against other societies. Actually, Pat, in one of your recent communications, you put it really beautifully. You simply said, because you sort of played off the idea of suicide and sociocide, and you said, I mean, sort of to you, it seems like what you're talking about is society committing suicide in some way, which I think is a very elegant, succinct way of defining what we're talking about, that there are forces that are breeding in the society itself, that are pulling society and people apart in ways that question the very sustainability of society, not just environmentally, but in terms of the ability to sustain relationships, which are the foundation of society itself. I don't know if you recall this, but right at the beginning of the book, I refer to a society called the Ik, which was a tribe in Uganda, written about by
Right.
an anthropologist named Colin Turnbull. The book was called The Mountain People. It was a very celebrated anthropological work. And it was about a society that he called the loveless society. In other words, he didn't find anywhere in the society people who were capable or disposed toward expressing any kind of warmth, attachment. They were completely absorbed in survival. And it was in their case, it was quite obvious why. The mountain people had been displaced from their sort of homeland by the Ugandan government into an area of Uganda where there was no food. And the people were surviving by the skin of their teeth. They were barely surviving. And the only way they could survive was by focusing 100% on going out and scavenging for food themselves. If they took time to try to, let's say, find some food for their children, or get some help for their spouse or for their friends, they would die because it took 100% of their focus on themselves to keep themselves alive. And so I raise this. Obviously, we're not a society starving in that sense. But I think what I was trying to say is that that provides a metaphor for thinking about sociocide, a society where people are so self-absorbed and so focused on meeting their own needs, both economically and psychologically and so forth, status-wise, that it's impossible for them to develop and sustain relationships with other people, whether they're in the family, friendship, and in the community, or cohesiveness in the society at large politically. And so the book is really, that's sort of the jumping out place for the book, that
Right.
America is becoming ick-like, meaning, I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. America has always been a very individualistic society and so forth, but I argue it's become, I'd written an earlier piece, as you guys know, called Sociopathic Society, which was about how societies can become antisocial, where the dominant norms of the society, it's contradictory, paradoxical, but that the dominant values are antisocial. And I argue that's long been the case in American, corporate capitalist societies and militarist society,
Right.
but that we've turned a sort of since the rise of neoliberalism in the 1990s, that this sociopathy of American society has emerged into a new, more, dangerous form, which I call sociocide, where sociopathy, a sociopathic society, becomes sociocidal. The sociopathic society survives, but with great difficulty as the norms are destructive, and society is damaged. In the socio society, the relationships are so deeply violent, ruptured, and the culture is and the economy is so focused on self-interest and survival that society is being pulled apart. There's simply no social relationship foundation that permits society to sustain. So, Pat, your notion that this was somehow about society committing suicide, I think put it very.
We're just trying to get our mind around what's going on with this Trump thing. And we've had on a psychiatrist that
Mhm.
looked at it from mental health issues. We even had on a geographer
Uh-huh.
who looked at it from, regions, and we've had psychologists on, economists, we've had psychologists, and you're a sociologist, and you're trying to make sense of it from your discipline. And let me just give you a couple of bullet points to riff on here. We are today at historic levels. We have more political polarization. Economic inequity is almost at historic levels. It's equal to the Gilded Age, and it's getting worse.
Inequality, you mean, Pat? Yeah,
In
just
any
the gap
inequality,
between rich and everybody else.
rich
Yes.
and poor. Social isolation. One of the things you as sociologists ask is how many good friends did you have in high school? And, you try to quantify how much
Right.
do you
Right.
eat alone? Do you eat with friends? So high levels of social isolation and this kind of cultural self-centeredness too, of we don't look beyond our culture. That's all that is occurring, and your book tries to look at it from your discipline and explain what's going on from your expertise. And it's just it's refreshing because it's it's just another take,
Right. And these
Did
are
I get
not
that kind of right?
mutually, Pat, I just want to say you put this very well. And I did, I'm a kind of interdisciplinary person, so I do a lot of political economy, as you know, and political science stuff. But this, of all the books I've done, this is the most sociological in exactly the ways you're talking about. Durkheim, the founders of sociology are usually viewed as three Europeans who kind of emerged in the late 19th century as they observed the rise of capitalism. And all three of them, Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, all concluded that essentially the rise of capitalism was creating a fundamental transformation in society, very broadly, in the economy, but linked to a much broader transformation in social relationships, which are sort of, as you point out, kind of the métier of sociologists, how we connect with each other or don't. And more broadly with the political possibilities. I use the term policide as well as sociocide, arguing that in the political sphere, the rise of sociocide, where society is kind of the bonds holding people together are collapsing, and people are kind of becoming ick-like, focused so centrally on their own survival that they can't really form durable relationships. Then you get the groundwork of a very authoritarian or fascist sort of society. I think if you look historically, that's very often one of the key foundations. And for example, the Frankfurt School, who looked at the rise of Hitler, argued that the breakdown of family relationships and social relationships during the Depression in the 20s and the early 30s in Germany was a very central part. They played a lot on the family issue as the rise of fascism occurred. And so I'm arguing in this book that, I don't separate these as you guys know from talking to me further, I don't think you can separate these sociological trends from the forms of economic power and inequality that are operating in the society. And so I focus in this book on, if you ask me, well, why is society pulling apart and relationships ungluing and people becoming extraordinarily focused on their own survival and, well-being as against, caring for and be saving. I'm arguing that this is emerging out of, like most, in my view, and this was Marx's view, that the economic system is the sort of underlying material foundation of everything that we see happening socially. And so in in the 1980s and 1990s, with the rise of Reagan, we see the rise of an economic system and an economic ideology and culture, which simply said there really is no such thing as a collective reality. The only thing that's real is the individual identity in the marketplace. The market is essentially society. And what is the market? It's simply individual actors seeking to maximize their own interests and survival in the society. There's no concept of collectivity. There's no we, there's only a me. This is sort of the way as you know, a lot of the writers of that time were writing books called The Virtue of Selfishness, and the idea that Milton Friedman, the whole kind of ideology of the time, was that what's democratic is guaranteed by the market because people are free to pursue. There's nobody in charge. The market provides the absolute foundation of democracy because there is government is perceived as an illusory collective it can only be coercive because the only genuine source of decision and autonomy is the individual. And that ideology that the individual was paramount, and there's no foundation for thinking of a collectivity. Milton Friedman was extremely strong on this, and he won a Nobel Prize. And the neoliberal economists, the neoclassical economists who rose during this period, their cultural and social view was very, very intense. They argued there is no such thing as a viable government beyond whatever is necessary to keep the market intact. Everything else is coercion.
Mm.
And therefore, any government that seeks to do anything other than protect the kind of laws and military that embodies the market is essentially destructive. And there was a lot of hypocrisy to that because, Reagan ran the biggest government deficits in history. I mean, capitalists, market theorists have always substantially relied on the state and government, both for military, global access to labor and resources and so forth, but also, the biggest source of system of welfare in the United States is the corporate welfare system. It's a system where, subsidies to big companies they're the foundation of everything that companies do. So there's enormous hypocrisy in this idea that there's no role for collectivity or government. But nonetheless, it became the ideology of Reagan, and Clinton and the Democrats would move very heavily away from. I mean, this is not a new ideology, obviously, in America. The one period in American history, in my view, where the idea that a collectivity and the role of the government was really central to the functioning of a good society was only in the New Deal era when, the intensity of the Depression created, a majoritarian, thing that lasted about 40 or 50 years that sort of made possible, the New Deal, labor unions, various kinds of expressions of solidarity and collectivity
Right.
that I think in those charts we were talking about before we went on air, they do show that in that period of the mid 20th century, you had a high watermark of social cohesion and social, a sense of collectivity, that the idea of collectivity and the we meant something. But shortly thereafter, it collapsed dramatically. And in those, charts that you showed, I know people can't see them right now, but they show that all these measures of social cohesion and collective solidarity began drastically declining in the period
Right.
after the late 60s. And that's my book. The only thing I'd want to add to that is that I situate this book to offer an explanation of why Trumpism and authoritarianism from a social point of view has had such a powerful resonance to so many Americans. And I think this idea that, and this is not new to me, I mean, de Tocqueville wrote about it, Hannah Arendt wrote it, great thinkers long before people like me came along have said that any kind of idea of democracy rests on the viability of people engaging in trusting, having a
Comedy.
culture of comedy, of social relations, where they have enough trust in other people that they're willing to abide by decisions of elections, where they're not so afraid of each other that they're arming up against each other, that they can believe. Because, solidarity and collectivity means that you're willing to give certain power and certain things over to a collectivity. And when you don't have a collectivity, you're just afraid and you're looking for a tough guy and a sort of authority figure who can basically, you feel, provide a sense of security and safety when you have nothing else to look for, right? There's nothing
Char-
holding
Char-
you up. There's no family, no community, no neighborhood, no union. I do pay a lot of attention to unions in the book, the first two
right.
chapters of the book.
Greg, is there some mutual thoughts about, your expertise in philosophy, economics, and Charlie's in sociology? Do you see solidarity with his spin on why it is so problematic right now with our political economy?
It's always been problematic. And I think that's a problem we have to look at when we talk about these things. Maybe we're not doing justice to it because it isn't the case that we've had long periods of cohesion and social solidarity and agreeableness. And that's just not the history of the United States. It's a false history.
Right.
And it isn't today that's so unusual. In fact, if we believe that today is so unusual, we've really gone off course and we haven't paid attention to our history. And I would say that in another way as well. If we don't pay attention to what's going on in other countries, concomitant with Trumpism, we're not going to understand Trumpism. We're going to get caught in the trap of blaming it on this individual who rode in on a very dark horse, and he's vulgar and he's crude and he's upset everything. If we don't understand Trump as the natural evolution of what preceded, we don't understand how the two-party system has fed this. We don't understand the attack on democracy that people like to talk about so much, particularly book writers, intellectuals, and professors. If we don't understand that war has been going on all the time through U.S. history, and it has its ups and its downs. That's the way we must understand these events. So my opposition, strong opposition to seeing this as though it's a trajectory that's fallen apart since the beginning of so-called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, after all, is a neologism, and it's neoliberalism, which suggests truthfully that there was a liberalism before it. And there always has been this political economy that Thatcher and Reagan brought in. I mean, Thatcher, to your point, Charlie, Thatcher was famously said, there is no society. I mean, if you can imagine anything more outrageous in terms of denying sociality, social being, Thatcher saying there is no such thing as society.
Right.
But that's a long tradition that goes way, way back. It was fought in the 30s, that time that we glorify as being one of growth of social solidarity was in the working class, but it wasn't even in the working class. There was the Black Legions, there was the KKK, there were all these social forces. There was the attempt to overthrow the government. It was even more broken than it is today in that era. It was broken in the 50s. Anti-communism and the hypocrisy of lynching and segregation blew up in our faces. And you got to remember, I'm old enough to remember, maybe you guys are a little younger than me perhaps, but I remember the Goldwater campaign, and I remember all the Coors foundations and all these people with this enormous money breaking up what seemed to be a new direction for this country. So I think we make a mistake in seeing this as some kind of a descent from 1950. In fact, unionization has declined steadily from 1950, not from 1980s.
Yeah.
As you suggested, but all the way from the 1950s.
So Greg, I'm getting your point. Before we came
Are you
on,
getting my point? Wait, before you leave me, are you getting my point?
well, I think
What is my point?
yeah, before we were looking at some charts that were saying that things were bad at the turn of the century, they were great in the middle of the century, and now they're bad again. And you're saying, wait a second, it has been a steady problem of the erosion of our economy and our relationships. Maybe there were small periods of time where things were better, but it's not as if there was
Well,
this
look,
great slope. Is that correct?
What I'm trying to bring in is history. I'm trying to say that history is a very complex thing, and it requires a very deep look at it. It requires stratifications. They have to see who things are good for. In the 50s, things were wonderful. My uncle, who worked, was a coal miner till early 60s, got a job in a DuPont plant, and he made great money. But Black people didn't do well in that period. And people who were leftists didn't do well in that period. And that's classic Americana. We have these conflicts, and they're there constantly, and they're fought constantly, and we win some and we lose some. Right now we're losing. And I think the question I'd like to ask Charlie and you, and we should discuss, is why are we losing now? Why are we losing now?
Yeah, well, the book does address that. And I just want to say the historical point that Greg is making is very consistent with the argument of this book. I think, in contrast to Europe, America has always had this kind of anti-state sort of kind of market focus, which is very different in Europe. Europe has always had a much more, and that's why European fascism is very different than American fascism. Let me just finish, Greg, that I completely embrace the idea that Trump is not a departure. I mean, actually, most of my writing in this book and elsewhere there has been since the beginning of the country, a very strong authoritarian dimension to American, and it's largely founded on both the way in which our economic system is structured and the way our culture has been organized in response to that. So if Greg is, I mean, I am not treating Trumpism here or the rise of this kind of more societal thing as a departure from the basic. I think America has always been defined, as I understood what Greg was just saying. What's been distinctive about America is that its level of social cohesion and social relationships and the level of collective identity has always been incredibly weak in the United States relative to particularly other European societies and so forth, but many other societies. So this book, in arguing for sociocide, is not saying, in some sense, sociocide is simply, and this is what the book argues, I'm very sensitized to the historical point that Greg is making. In fact, I make a good deal in many of the current books. The thing I'm most worried about the Trump resistance movement is it's treating Trumpism as some sui generis phenomenon. And if we can just go back to the pre-Trump normalcy, then we're back in good times again. And that's the last thing I want to suggest. If we go back, if the Trump resistance goes back simply to restore what was America before Trump, we will quickly develop another new Trump. I mean, it's precisely the conditions that existed in both in American economics and in American culture and political culture that long predate this. As you might remember, when we talked about my earlier book, Who Owns Democracy, we take that back to the founding. And actually, one of my new books is about how the American Constitution was modeled after the Magna Carta, which was never a democratic idea. The idea of the Magna Carta was to limit the monarch, but simply, the British name of the Magna Carta was the Compact of the Barons, the Article of the Barons. The barons were, of course, the nobles who wanted to pay less taxes to the king, who was going off on adventures in France and so forth, and taxing other nobility. It was never, the founders of this country never imagined a world in which ordinary people would have a democratic voice. I mean, that's not just the fact that less than the only idea of who was able to vote was propertied white men, which they took from, but
Right.
it was part of a broader vision. The Constitution is, I think, very, very badly misunderstood because it was always basically an oligarchic vision that America should be run, and it was run. The same people running America before the Revolution, they had these names like Jefferson and Washington, and many of them were slave owners, Madison, who wrote the Constitution. Well, those same people ran the country after the Revolution. It was a revolution. I mean, it was not against the monarch even at that point, because Britain was being run by Parliament in 1776, not by King George. So there's just a lot of mythology about the level of democracy in America long, long before Trump. We've always been in an oligarchic society, and it's always been associated with this kind of uniquely anti-collective, anti-state vision that goes all the way back to, and we had our own barons take over after our Magna Carta, which were the robber barons of the first Gilded Age, and then the new robber barons of the Silicon Valley, who simply brought their own versions of this. This is where I'm just aligning myself with Greg's idea that there's nothing there. This is a deep part of American history. It's part of the reason that
Right.
Trump is so deeply entrenched in a way. I think there are new things that are going on because the waves of these basically authoritarian forms of, anti-collective governance and so forth, that's the history of the United States. I agree with that.
Charlie, let me add to your sociocide thing. I mean, in the spirit of sociocide, I just read an article in the London Review of Books. I think you'd find it interesting. And coincidentally, it's about TikTok, but that's just coincidentally. This guy wants to try to understand Farage and the reform people, the people that support
Right.
that's the similar counterpart movement
Right.
in England. So what is it, to cut to the chase, what he finds is that there's this wholesale sense of unhappiness, dissatisfaction, a sense that everything is broken, everything is going wrong, and overriding corruption everywhere in government, in driving and buying a car, and there's a social collapse, so to speak.
Mhm.
Is that what would you call that sociocide? Is that a counterpart to sociocide as you've studied it here, or is that a different phenomenon?
Well, like I say, I think European fascism has a longly different history than American authoritarianism and fascism. And I mean, Britain, Thatcher sort of represented more of the American idea, anti-collect state identity than almost any other European. The European far-right parties right now are, I'm not completely responding to what you said, but I just want to point out that they are not challenging the collectivity of the state as Trump is doing and the Republicans are doing in the current budget. They're not trying to smash social service, take away health care, education and so forth. The far right, because the European tradition is so different, because they have a concept of the collectivity, that the far right, the Farage, all these people who are far right in Europe, they're very different than Trump. They're not trying to savage and smash the the sort of possibility of a collective. That's one thing. As to whether the same phenomenon is going on, I do believe that the underlying conditions giving rise. I mean, the reason I focus on neoliberalism was I think people, and the election of this, the surprising success of the Democratic Socialist mayor in the New York primary yesterday, was just some kind of, I mean, the kind of stuff, the fact that Bernie and AOC have been drawing these very, very large crowds in red states to their Fight Oligarchy tour is just to measure the fact that over the last 30, 40 years, the level of economic, people saying, well, we're not, the economy has been doing relatively well. For the vast majority of working people, the economy has been terrible. It just goes worse and worse. What is 62% of Americans say they live paycheck by paycheck. And one of the things I found interesting when I researched this book was that the social capital, the book talks a lot about the concept of social capital. Social capital is a concept that a French Marxist named Pierre Bourdieu, a very famous writer, a very interesting writer in France. He argues that in looking at capital, there's the financial capital that we customarily think about. There's also social capital. And he says the social capital is the amount of sort of integration of an individual into meaningful networks, social networks, communities, and relationships, which give them a kind of power of its own, much as financial capital gives people a kind of privilege and power. And he argues that the collapse of social capital is a very central part of understanding how working people respond. So one of the things I found in this book as I was looking at the data on how deeply broken social relationships are in America was that, and this I think is not widely understood. In fact, usually it's quite, is that the traditional working classes are reporting the greatest amount of social disconnection. There's sort of an image that, well, the upper middle class are individualistic, they go off and they're cosmopolitan and globalist, and they don't connect in local communities. But the data is actually interesting. And these are surveys that come out of actually fairly conservative foundations. But they found that social capital was weakest in the working class. In other words, there are kind of civic deserts in poor parts of cities, in rural areas, and so forth, where there have not been investment in the kinds of public infrastructure, whether we're talking about parks, child care centers, public gardens, the places where people meet each other and socialize, the bowling alleys that Putnam talks about and so forth. All these things are deserts in area. There's what um, the empirical studies of this show is that working people are being cut off from each other and from some sort of public sort of connection, a sense of collectivity. The people really subjected to empirically now, just looking at the data, the people who say they have the least number of friends, 70% of people say they eat all their meals alone. About 60% say, I don't trust anybody that I talk to. That sentiment, which is very powerful and which is a theme all through this book, is most powerfully expressed among working people. And I think that goes against the sort of cultural norm that, well, working class people are sort of bound up in traditional church and communities and are more connected. And in fact, the data suggest that
Just the
the
opposite.
epidemic of loneliness and isolation, the kind of thing of atomization, Pat, that you were talking about, is much more intense. This is just now based on a lot of survey data and so forth in the working class. And I think when you say, why is Trumpism emerging as powerfully as it is today, I completely agree with Greg. There's nothing new here. This is the story of America, but it's a question of sort of the sort of intensity of the problems. I think what we're seeing today is if you Greg asked the question, why has it become so, this breakdown so intense today relative to the long history of all this? I think one of the things that comes out of my own work with this book is the idea that we're seeing a melding of a breakdown and division of financial capital with a concomitant breakdown of social capital, dividing and reinforcing each other. So the working people who are the parts of the population that appear to be voting for Trump are most drawn to MAGA are exactly the people who are at the downward, their economic prospects are very bad. They're feeling they live paycheck by paycheck. They don't feel secure. One job loss, one illness, and they can collapse. They don't have an economic or social service support. At the same time, these people are experiencing, everybody is, but when you say I eat all my meals alone, I don't have any good friends. I don't have somebody that I talk to. Maybe I have posts on social media, and I talk a lot in this book about the extent to which social media is or not. I think that there's a whole analysis in this book, Bonfire, about Silicon Valley and the way in which the rise of social media is playing an extremely important role in the breakdown of social capital among young people, so that my students are on TikTok and Instagram 4 or 5 hours a day. When I ask them, how much do you feel connected to these people? They laugh. These are not meaningful connections. These are, in a way, individuals, reaching out into a void, subject to commercializing influencers who they say they don't have any idea who's paying them and how to trust them. So we have a generation of young people who presumably, Silicon Valley is producing a whole new world of connection. You might say, well, how can you talk about the breakdown of social relations and so forth when we have a new world of social media? But social media is operating in a very paradoxical way. It provides the illusion of connection, but again, and this is for working class people as well as college students and so forth, it is not providing people when they say, I'm eating alone. I'm not finding people to talk to day to day. This is the reality of people who are simultaneously being subjected to extreme economic stress. No, it's not the stress that Germans were feeling in the early 30s in Germany, but it's a real economic stress. And it is combined, I mean, from what both of you said, there is a sense of a kind of broader systemic breakdown that I think is associated both with the breakdown of people's sense of connection to other people, with any kind of trust in the political system today. And I think a lot of this, the part we haven't talked about, is the enormous role the Democratic Party has played in giving rise to Trump and to all of these problems, because the Democratic Party, abandoned the New Deal, which was just at least a semblance of attention to the idea of a collectivity and to the idea that working people had a place in America. And all of that, the Democratic Party has played a crucial role, which I outline in this book in some detail, in essentially moving away from the kind of class solidarity politics, creating a kind of identity politics, which contributes to this sense of fragmenting the population. It all depends on, what's your race, ethnicity, gender orientation, all of these things, which are just absolute gifts to an authoritarian who can basically use all these identity. Trump is a form of white identity politics, which goes way back in history, from the very beginning. And it's a way of basically consolidating white working class people legitimately and understandably against a party, the Democratic Party, which abandoned them, which no longer speaks to their economic interests or their collective interests, socially and culturally, and simply highlights identity politics as a solution when it's actually intensely aggravating the problem, to the point that even young Blacks, Hispanics, one of the strong results of the 2024 election was the move of young Blacks and Hispanics into the Republican Party. So I think that, you can't really understand this phenomenon. We're a system of two parties. There are two corporate parties. The Democratic Party is a completely lost soul right now. I mean, they have no clarity. And whether the Democratic Party, it does remind me of the early periods of the 30s, because you had, in the Germany, as Hitler was coming into power, you had, a large communist party and a ruling social democratic party, and they simply collapsed in the early 30s, to the point they were fighting each other and unable to provide any kind of, cohesive political response to the far right that was rising with Hitler. And I think there's a big parallel.
Let me get to that. When you were talking about the lack of social cohesion, and Greg and I are both from the Midwest, and we go back to our really dying parts of the country. You're talking about working class people. Fewer public spaces, libraries, parks, community centers, less civic engagement, less volunteering, religious groups, unions gone. A civic desert, if you will, in social relations in this working class people. And
you're taking that off from my book there, aren't you? You're reading comments.
That's correct.
Yes.
That's your book.
But yeah, because it sounded familiar.
Okay, so here is J.D. Vance and Steve Bannon talking about Bowling Alone, which is kind of your same similar field, discovering that declining social capital was a remarkable good strategy for Trump's political strategy. That when you have these deserts of lack of engagement, they are ripe for MAGA-like rage, cohesion, focus.
Yes.
I don't know. Greg, what do you think about that? Is it?
I just want to say that's been what I've been saying. Again, the thrust of this
agree
book.
on that. There's no question that that's the case. And, when you have no other option, when you have a two-party system and then you realize you don't have an option either way, you're given the privilege of voting every 2 or 4 years for people you have no relationship with that are billionaires. Yeah, of course, you're looking for an option. And unfortunately, it's this vulgar person that whose name I will not speak. So yeah, we agree on that. We all agree on that.
Okay, so I have another question for you.
Trump. I just want to say thank you for reading those points, because it'll give the audience a sense of what this book is digging into, which is, to my mind, what makes this book a little unusual. It does get into very personal, emotive issues, that everybody, whatever their politics, everybody is affected by the nature of their relationships to other people, to their family, to their friends, to their classmates, to people on social media. And I think what makes this book maybe more accessible than many of the books that are being written on Trump right now is that it tries to connect the politics. With the rise of feminism, there was this revelation that politics was always very personal. And I think what I was trying to do in this book, because I'm doing a lot of other kinds of, writing about the legal and economic and so forth, is emphasize how personal and emotional this, just like feminism discovered how political, started, they said it starts in the bedroom, starts in the nature of the relationships that people have at their kitchen table and so forth. I think what I'm trying to do in this book is use the data that's available in the history. And the book, what Greg said about history is just absolutely central to my thinking. But I do think that what people would find interesting in this book are the kinds of phrases you sort of were citing from the book, Pat, that
Mhm.
that sort of get into these issues about how personal relationships and personal and social relationships spill out into broader political and economic forces, and both reflect them and are caused by them. And that's what I hope people will take from this book is just as the feminist movement sort of made clear to so many people how intimate personal things help to shape politics. I think Trumpism, you raise how each discipline, in this particular book, I'm trying to show how the shaping of social relationships, and in our case, the really scary erosion, these civic deserts of relational emptiness, where people simply are eating alone, watching TV or posting alone deep into the night. These are and I think J.D. Vance and the New Right if you read the New Right, they played off this idea very strongly, and they recognized. I mean, I think there's not much insight in a lot of the far right, but they
They love
recognize.
Gromsky.
Yeah, in a way, they understood
They,
propaganda, and yeah,
they
and they
love him more than
understood.
AOC loves him. I mean, that's
Yeah,
got to be saying something.
yeah.
So
But
here's
anyway,
another question. We're running out of some time, and I really like to get Greg and your opinion about this. Trump talks about, I'm the biggest, I had the biggest landslide, I had the biggest, mandate, everybody loves me, I won everything. Trump won by 1.5% of the vote. I mean, he barely squeaked by.
right.
FDR won by almost 25%. LBJ 20 some percent, Reagan 18%. I mean, those were landslides. This is just like a teeny thing. And if you look at the guy who just won the mayor or is going to be the mayor of New York, he spent a lot of time talking to people and engaging with the public. And they said it's the economy, stupid. The rents
Mhm.
are too damn high. I can't pay for child support. These
Right,
simple little economic features
right.
are what tip the scale to where we get this pretty destructive political person. Is a simple economic fix gonna kind of purge us of this, or is the damage that he's doing to our institutions so great it'll take decades to get over?
If I could just say, I think the Democratic Party plays a huge role in what you just said, because although Biden did do some, public investment, basically it's not been able to really come online. And the Democratic Party, for the reasons I've already said, has moved completely away from a class-based, a focus. We're living in the period of the greatest economic inequality in American history. It's just, I mean, 800 billionaires have concentrated wealth in a way we've never had in America. I mean, I write a lot about the robber barons of the Gilded Age, and the whole history of the oligarchy and corporate life. It's always been a part of American history. It's a continuity, but the concentration of wealth is really extreme today. I listened to the book that, I have a few companies in Silicon Valley, which are multi-trillion-dollar companies, and companies like JP Morgan Chase, which is the Rockefeller Morgan, legacy of that, but they are, a few hundred billion. I'm not trying to say those have gone away, but we're just living in a period of such concentrated economic, concentration of finance, which translates, of course, into enormous concentration of political power. And that's what people are seeing playing out today, this sort of grift and corrupt kind of connection between the White House and the larger oligarchy, starting with Musk and now, just more broadly in the oligarchy, and the billionaires who are in his cabinet. And I think, though, Pat, that the deeper civic deserts and the deeper economic forces that are essentially eroding the sense of the very possibility of a collective meaning, something which people take as real. It's just a perfect formula for Trumpism. It's like saying if people don't have connections, if they're eating alone, if they're posting into the ether, people are scared. I think we're wired to be we're a social species. We're wired for connections. When you don't have connections, you are not happy campers. When that's tied to an economic system, which is really destroying your social and economic security. And much of this book is about the destruction of the capitalist concept of employment, of a relationship which was exploitative, but was a relationship that brought, that's what Marx said, capitalism brings labor out of the household into a collective space that could be a source of liberation. The factor where people would build connections with other people. That's being destroyed now, where people but they don't have a home to go back to. Maybe the privileged people do, but in those in the civic deserts, when they're pulled out into remote labor, they don't have a home to go back, a community to go back in. They're in a desert. And so I think, this combination of collapse of social capital with economic capital, it's a mighty blow to working people. And unless you have a political party that is truly speaking, I think in New York, this guy managed to speak to a lot of these issues. The way he spoke, the kind of energy he brought, the fact, as he said, he listened rather than speaking. I think that, and the fact that, hundreds of thousands of people have turned out for the, Fight Oligarchy tour by Bernie and AOC. That's, they're just indications. As you said, Pat, Trump won by a relatively small margin. I wouldn't minimize it as much as you did, because if you look at counties all over the country, about 95% of the counties shifted further right than they had been before. It was a small margin, but there were trends that are alarming about that. And I think they reflect the depth of what Greg was talking about this overall sense of social breakdown, which is connected to what I've been talking about, the breakdown of civic life and connections with other people tied to this incredible concentration of economic wealth and power. So I think we're dealing with and as Greg said, this is built into the bloodstream of American history, which this is not a new phenomenon. It's just taken, the oligarchy has taken new forms, the communication and propaganda through social media and so forth, and AI is both economically and culturally. AI, which is where the far right, people like Peter Thiel and Vance are putting a lot of their eggs, is just a scary thing. You're seeing an integration of Silicon Valley with the military. And, I think Trump's movement into Iran is just a kind of reflection of the fact that these quote libertarian Silicon Valley Trumpist types like Peter Thiel and Mark Anderson and David Sachs, these billionaires in his cabinet, many of whom have a connection to Silicon Valley. This all has a scary militaristic kind of neo-fascist trend into it. Peter Thiel is, he's running, Palantir is creating a master data set of everybody's basic information, which is, we haven't had in this country before, and which can be used for, very authoritarian purposes. So I take very seriously the dangers that we're looking at right now. And I don't think the Democrats have their act together yet. And so we have a big challenge. I think the best thing is that people are responding. 6 months after Hitler came in, the Social Democratic Party had been outlawed. The communists had been killed or destroyed. The Reichstag had been, the Enabling Act was in March 23rd, which basically eliminated the legislature. The courts were not. So despite Trump's rapid move, we still are able to have people on the streets without being murdered. We still have, parties, and we have attacks on the courts and on all these things. The immigrants are the new Jews, and we're seeing a lot of parallels, but there are differences. My big fear, as I mentioned before, which I suspect Greg shares, is that the resistance is normalizing the pre-Trump era. It's sort of attributing all these problems to Trump, whereas I think I'm in sort of alignment with Greg and the idea that Trumpism is simply a sort of continuity of a very, very, it's in the bloodstream of America. The far right, I mean, well, I said it before. I mean, there's important new scale levels here and things that are happening that are somewhat different. But this is deep in the American bloodstream, and it's something we need to take very seriously. And my critique of the anti-Trump resistance, I'm celebrating the size of the resistance and the bravery, because most people I know are afraid. I mean, I've been told that just being on a show like this could potentially be dangerous. And I've had a lot of threats, and, I'm sort of accustomed to that, but it's at a different level. I've been, I mean, I have my issues about what I can teach in the university and so forth. So we're in an environment that's very perilous, and people need social supports. I think what's hopeful is that people are finding new communities in these resistance struggles, and that is crucially important. And we're seeing, elements of a new labor struggle and some campus struggles and so forth that offer, and some people within the Democratic Party that all offer a possibility of rebuilding these civic, moving beyond these civic and economic crises we're in. But it's a big challenge. And the normalization of the pre-Trump, the worry that the Trump resistance is simply an effort to move back to the pre-Trump era. That's very central to this book and other books I'm writing. That it's I celebrate the resistance, but I worry all the time that the resistance is going to try to sort of. And in my work with Noam Chomsky, when I was talking with him prior to some of his health issues, he really worried about the same thing, that the crises we're facing around militarism and climate and economic inequality run the danger of being eclipsed by a sort of distraction with Trump, sort of at treating Trump as a completely unique phenomenon, where in a way Trump is simply the newest expression of the militarism and corporatism that always has betrayed America and betrayed working people in America.
Well, we've got to wrap up here. I'll give Greg the last word. Any final thoughts about what a
No,
bummer Charlie's been and how
I don't
depressed
have
you
to,
are
I don't have to
about
say. Well,
there's
let me
no
say,
hope.
okay, no more foreplay. Okay, let's be over the foreplay. No, I don't have to talk very much because I quite agree with virtually everything that Charlie just said, and he speaks for me when he describes the situation we're in. I would only add a little more optimistic in this sense. I think that Trumpism is self-destructing to some extent and will continue to self-destruct. People see through. I have confidence in people in a long view. People are going to see through this whole Musk phenomena, this debacle that he did with Musk. They're going to see through his Iran policies. They're going to be affected by this these thugs that run around at ICE and so on. So I think that the Trumpism is going to suffer a blow, and it's going to afford us an opportunity, some space to do something. But Charlie is exactly right. My fears, he speaks for my fears when he says the danger is going back to the old normal. And we'll buy some time, we'll have some time, but we've got to do something with that time in terms of breaking away from this obsession with this two-party system. And Charlie was on the verge of talking about that. I wish he would have went on. I'd gladly give up my time to hear more about that. But I exactly agree with what he said. And let's just keep positive. And I'm going to a rally in a few hours around the Iran fiasco, rejecting that and standing against that and trying to stop any further development of it, because I think Israel is going to continue to try to take advantage of the
Oh,
situation.
absolutely.
And that's what
Right.
they're
I just want
doing.
to add, if I could, I'm glad because I feel aligned with Greg on many of these issues. But Pat, in terms of your sense of my being a bummer here, I want to say that that was interesting to me because people, the book itself, and people when they listen to me, they feel I tend to be overly optimistic. I mean, I do tend to have a positive view. I believe in people.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I'd have this focus on caring and relationships and so forth if I wasn't deeply engaged with people and believing in them. I mean, I think there are people who are political and don't like the American people or don't like people in general. I have, and I guess I share some of Chomsky's views in this sense. I have a positive, despite the horrors of history that you simply would be crazy to deny, and all the problems that Greg just sort of affirmed. I have, I don't think people reading this book or any of my work would come away saying this guy is a downer because while I do talk about I try to be as honest as I can be about the problems. I have this optimistic, maybe overly optimistic view, which I guess keeps me, living and engaging. I really do believe that history shows that despite this long authoritarian, corporate, militaristic, legacy that we're dealing with. There's always been a history of resistance and and that history is not meaningless. It hasn't sort of created nirvana, but it shows that even on the worst of times, we have a good shot at making change if we commit to it. And throughout this book, at the end of this book, I give a pretty optimistic view of the possibilities of what kind of change might empower that ongoing resistance. So this is not and I like to speak to groups that were related to Indivisible or to, the fight oligarchy things. I have a new book called Fighting Oligarchy, which is coming out soon. And then another one on the authoritarian wiring of America, which is about how to rewire the country in a democratic way. So I just want to say that I think what I'm trying to do here is be true to the history, but at the same and to the magnitude of the problems we're dealing with, but very much from the point of view that to know that history is to be liberating. And it's not, if I didn't believe in the possibility of this kind of change, I wouldn't bother to write this stuff because it's not fun to write stuff if you're not believing that it's going to make some kind of difference. You're just wasting your time.
Yeah,
So
and I think you're clear too that you're not saying TikTok is causing social isolation. You're saying TikTok is a symptom of problems in our society, and all of your that are contributing to behavior that's not very helpful for people. So,
yeah. I mean, I think there are elements of social media that do contribute to the problem because it's being designed in ways that give
well,
power
yeah,
to,
yeah, there, that's
people at
bad.
the very top. But yes, and
Charlie,
I have
listen,
a positive and affirmative view of people. I love people, so
I
including you
just
guys. So I'm, I just don't want to leave the impression that
right.
I'm feeling hopeless about this situation.
Well,
Not.
I have some good news for you. As I was doing work on Sociocide, I found out that there is a punk rock group in San Diego that's named Sociocide.
No kidding.
So maybe as today's bling, I'll send you a Sociocide punk rock shirt. So
You
there you
guys are
go.
great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for
Hey,
having
thank you,
me.
Charlie. You're
Thanks,
always a
Charlie.
lot of I always learn from you, and I'm also frustrated that when I chat with you, I wish we could just go on and on, but
Yeah.
got to
Well, it's
stop
lovely to
somewhere.
see
So
both of you, to see you're doing well. And thank
yeah,
you for the opportunity and hope we'll be able to
Do
chat
it
again.
again. We got to do it
let's
Yeah,
do it
again.
again.
that'll be
Thanks,
good.
Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay, be well, guys. Take care. Remember,
Thanks.
I'm a Midwestern with you too. So I Champaign, Urbana, Illinois.
All
Yeah.
That's
right.
right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you.
Take care. Thanks, guys.